we are actually blasted with huge amount of light when we walk into a grocery store or drugstore. And that amount of light is enough to suppress our melatonin so that we stay awake. So the melatonin hormone goes down. It also increases alertness because the same cells signal to the brain saying, hey, this is daytime, you should be staying awake. So that's why it's not a good idea to spend too much time in the evening in a brightly lit store or in any place that's super bright. It's almost like having a couple of cups of coffee in the evening.
Welcome to the Better Podcast. It's me, your host, Dr. Stephanie Estima. And today we are talking to Dr. Satchin Panda all about light, circadian and infradian rhythms, and how this affects women in midlife. Dr. Satchin Panda is a leading expert in the field of circadian rhythm research. He is a professor at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies and a founding executive member of the Center for Circadian Biology at the University of California in San Diego. Dr. Panda is a Pew Biomedical Scholar and a recipient of the Julian Martin Mid-Career Award in Aging Research. So today's show, we talk all about light, sleep, exercise, and eating, and how we actually have control over all of those things, and how we can what are some of the mechanisms that happen in the body when we are optimizing for light exposure, for when we eat, when we exercise, and when we sleep. We talk all about this in the lens of women in midlife. So we talk about the changes that happen to our circadian and infradian rhythms as we age and we move through menopause, perimenopause, and menopause specifically. And Dr. Panda talks about what are some of the strategies that we can implement to help improve our lives in these areas. Now, I will say he recorded this episode at the Salk Institute, and it does appear that the Salk Institute is right in the flight pathway of fighter jets. So I'm asking in advance for your forgiveness because you will hear a fighter jet or two. You might hear some construction or whatever was happening during our recording. We've tried to, and we will optimize that as best we can, but you may hear at some points a fighter jet, like I said, or two. I think that this is a fantastic episode for anybody that is looking for a low cost, or in most cases, no cost way to optimize your health and well-being. I think that most of the techniques that we talked about and strategies we talked about are free to most. We have, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world. We actually distinguish between northern countries, southern countries, and the longitudinal and latitudinal lines, and how we can align all of those with our circadian rhythms. I want you to pay attention, if you can, all the way to the end of this episode where we get into the after party, which is my real thoughts and my favorite moments of the show. So make sure that you tune in for that. And without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Satchin Panda. Dr. Satchin Panda, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
We are talking all about circadian biology today, and I wanted to jump right in with you. Tell us about why it is maybe as important, just as important, maybe even more important to consider when we are eating during the day versus what we are eating during the day.
Yeah, so the term circadian literally means about a day. So that means in our body, almost every gene, every neurochemical, every digestive juice, and even every hormone rises and falls at a certain time of the day or night. And all these rhythms are primarily controlled by our own genetic makeup. We have a dozen or so genes that make this timing tick. But at the same time, we are actually the master conductor of this circadian rhythm, because when we sleep, when we see light, or when we eat, it actually controls all of these rhythms. Just imagine, just by deciding when to eat, you can actually change thousands of genes turning on and off, and all your hormones turning on and off in different parts of your body and mind. And that's really amazing, and it's also mind-boggling. But what we can now do is, by understanding this biology of circadian rhythm, we can make much better decisions about when to eat. And connecting back to your question, just imagine your best friend. So imagine your healthy diet is your best friend. And if your best friend shows up in your home at 2 o'clock in the morning and knocks on your front door, even though the best friend may be knocking very gently, that person will not be your best friend forever. So similarly, eating a healthy diet in the wrong time can wreak havoc to your circadian rhythm. So it's almost like throwing sand to a gearbox. And that's why eating at the right time is as important as eating a healthy diet.
And let's just contrast this for a moment, because this is going to be a very female-specific conversation. But let's contrast circadian rhythms with infradian rhythms, which are typically, longer than a 24-hour cycle. Can you give us some examples of an infradian rhythm and how that contrasts with circadian rhythms?
Yeah, so for example, for perimenopausal women, the menstrual cycle or estrous cycle in all animals is infradian rhythm. And on an average, for women, it's around 28 days. But at the same time, we know that if your circadian rhythm is disrupted, so for particularly people or women who are working as shift workers, or those who are frequently traveling across time zones, that circadian rhythm disruption also disrupts their menstrual cycle. So sometimes they can be much shorter, or sometimes they can be much longer, and sometimes they just become irregular. And in fact, there are also studies done in both humans and laboratory animals showing that if you disrupt circadian rhythm, then it not only affects these hormonal rhythms, infradian hormonal rhythm, it also affects the ability to conceive and ability to keep a healthy pregnancy. And that was kind of surprising for many of us, because we thought that, well, those rhythms may be not connected. But now more and more research is showing that these two rhythms are also connected, so that if you disrupt one, then you disrupt the other. And conversely, what is good news is if you actually maintain a good circadian rhythm, then your menstrual cycle is much more regular. And some women, although there is no studies done, some women who have difficulty conceiving, they can also pay attention to their sleep-wake cycle and daily rhythms, and they seem to improve. Their chance of getting healthy pregnancy also goes up.
That is fantastic. I think that already we have a win from the podcast, because I actually didn't realize the impact that each of them had on each other. I thought that they were sort of two different, separate and distinct rhythms that sort of ran independently of each other. But I think that that's fantastic, and we'll dive into that as well. Let's talk about, as we're talking about circadian rhythm, is everybody, one of the things that I've heard, and I've had people on the show talk about different chronotypes, where some people might say, well, I know that I should go to sleep at a certain time, but I'm just a night owl, or I'm an early bird. And I forget the other animals that we talk about. It's like, I'm an ox, I'm a wolf, I'm a whale, I'm a dolphin, whatever they are. So can you talk about this idea of chronotypes? I've spoken to, for example, Kristen Holmes I think she was talking about a study where she had, maybe not, she didn't conduct it herself, but there was, I guess some scientists looked at putting people in a cave, and after a certain amount of time, everybody was sort of on the same rhythm. Maybe you can expand on that. You are the person to do that. So talk to us about chronotypes. Do they exist? Are we all biologically unique in terms of night owl, early morning person, et cetera?
Yeah, so the term chronotype appeared maybe 30, 40 years ago in describing people who tend to wake up early or tend to go to bed very late. And the idea was, well, if we can differentiate people who are likely to go to bed very late and they don't mind staying awake very late, then maybe they are suitable for night shift work, for example. And those who are waking up very late or waking up very early, then they may be suitable for early morning shift. And also it kind of helps people to understand how their habitual tendency to go to bed is different from people around them. So then the question is it genetic? Is it imprinted? So that just like some people are predisposed to have blue eyes or brown eyes? Is it already imprinted? Are we born like that? And unfortunately, we're not born like that. It's very rare, although there is a genetic basis. It may be 1 in 150 or 1 in 300 people who may have a genetic predisposition to go to bed very early or go to bed very late. But when you think about it, when you talk to people around us, you'll roughly find that 1/3 of people will say, I'm an early bird, and 1/3 of people will say, I'm a night owl. So why is that? And just start to ask a very simple question. When you were a kid, and particularly people, who are in their 20s and 30s, starting from there, because kids now are very different. When you were a kid, what time you typically went to bed? And from your parents, you will hear that, well, most kids actually went to bed between, say, 7 and 9 in the evening, right?
Yeah.
And so that means we are actually born with a normal circadian rhythm. We are programmed to go to bed early in the evening. And what happens is during teenage, due to hormonal changes or something, we don't understand it very well, that we tend to become a little bit night owl. And that's because what we think, and again, this is not well tested because of difficulty of doing experiments with teenagers before the age of 18, because you need parental assent and kids participate. What we think happens is during teenage, our hormones make us more sensitive to light. So that means in the evening, as we have more and more lighting, and teenagers are also more likely to engage with their smartphone, and they're also more likely to be engaged in evening activities. So for example, many of the sports practices are in the evening. Many other hobbies and other things they have to do to get to college also happens in the evening. So as a result, what happens is they get habituated to going to bed later and later. And that stays with all of us, because even there are studies on hundreds of thousands of people showing that right after we hit puberty, we tend to become a little bit of night owl because of all this societal pressure, light sensitivity, and all of this contribute so that teenagers are more likely to go to bed almost after midnight. And then after high school, again, you go to college, the same thing continues. And then you have 8 to 10 years of habit, whether it's personal choice or peer pressure, or even high school and colleges now giving you your deadline for submitting homework is midnight. So
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
all of these are forcing our teenagers and young adults to stay awake late into the night. And then some people just stay with that habit, because during that time, to stay awake late into the night, they also get into the habit of drinking coffee and all these beverages that help you stay awake. And we kind of forget that those things are keeping us awake. And slowly, you'll see that 1/3 of people become night owl.
Okay, well, I have a question about the teenagers then. Is there evidence in earlier societies that they didn't have this sort of phasic shift? Because you are describing my teenagers now. So they want to play. I had a soccer game. They started the soccer game at 9 p.m. at night. I was enraged by this because it means that they're done at 11, which means they're home at midnight, and then they have to unwind. They have to shower. They have to do all the things. So you were describing literally my teenage, and then they want to unwind with friends, and that means, talking on their phones and all the things. So do we know teenagers in earlier societies prior to, widespread use of phones and maybe even televisions, were they all going to sleep with the adults, or were they all always different?
So there are some really beautiful studies done by Horacio de la Iglesia, and then there are quite a few other sleep researchers over the last 25, 40 years. They have gone to many communities where there is very minimal electrical lighting. So for example, a household might have only 1 or 2 light bulbs, that's all. And there is no nighttime soccer practice or anything. What they have seen is, yes, you are right, there is no difference between teenagers and adults. They all go to bed sometime between 9:30 and 10:30. And it's also important that we always think that without electricity, people were going to bed after sunset. No. They're actually keeping the lights on with some firelight. And just like you said, we are social animals. So at the end of the day, we want to unwind with friends. And teenagers should talk to their friends or maybe family. There'll be chat around the firelight, and then they would go to bed between 9:30 and 10:30. And they would wake up exactly around dawn when the sun is up, they would wake up. So yes, you are right. There was no early bird or night owl in before widespread use of excessive evening light. The converse experiment has also been done by one of my collaborators and esteemed colleague, Ken Wright Jr. from University of Colorado, where he actually took some of his own students and other college students who claimed that they're night owl. They are diehard night owl. They cannot go to bed before midnight. And then he took them for camping. In camping, there is not much light and there is no too much evening activities. And he actually measured their dim light melatonin. So melatonin rises when we go to bed. And when these kids were in cities, in their regular life, then their dim light melatonin would begin to start later in the evening, which was in alignment with these kids going to bed after midnight. But then when they went camping, within 3 to 4 days, they all went to bed between 9 and 10. And the dim light melatonin also came back to normal, like 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, the melatonin would begin to rise. And that's, I think, one of the best evidence that those who claim to be night owl, if you remove all the light, stress, and afternoon or evening caffeine intake, then many of them, I'm not claiming that all of them will become normal because there is still a tiny fraction, as I said, 1 in 150 to 1 in 250 who still have some genetic predisposition to stay awake late into the night. But the vast majority of people will become early, I won't say early bird, but they're still going to bed between 9:30 and 10:30 or 11.
But they'll reset their circadian patterning, right? So maybe they had a shift later in the day because they were being exposed to light. Maybe they were eating late. Maybe they were exercising late. All the things that you described at the top of our conversation that we have agency over. So we can choose when we sleep. We can choose when we eat. We can choose when we exercise. We can choose what light is coming in. But when you have this ability to reset it, which is also incredibly empowering because you have agency now, you can control the outcome. And to your point, yes, there's always going to be outliers. There's always a rule breaker for every rule that we make. There's always going to be some percentage of the population that can break it. But I love this idea of being able to control that and control some of the genes that we can turn on and off just by our habits. I think that's phenomenal.
Yeah. I mean, this is a simple example where people are essentially changing the hormonal rhythm from their brain by just taking away electrical lighting and evening coffee.
So let's talk about moving from the teenage years and maybe even post college, because I know when I was in my professional studies and my professional schooling, I was also round the clock studying, especially for board exams. Good grief, I don't think I slept a wink that week because they were like back to back to back all week long. When you've graduated, let's say, and then you get into a rhythm of I'm working, let's call it something like 9 or 10 in the morning until something like 5 or 6 in the evening, how does that pattern, maybe into your young adult years and then moving into midlife, and specifically I'd love to look at women here, how does that circadian timing shift naturally or unnaturally, and what are some of the mechanisms and things at play there?
Yeah, I think if you are lucky, you would actually get a 9 to 5 job these days.
Yes. Yeah.
But the point is, when after all these years of staying awake late into the night, you have picked up so many habits that actually are very difficult to get rid of. So, for example, you might have, at least in the weekend, night out with your friends, and then you may still be hooked to having a caffeine drink or a tea or a matcha or whatever in the evening that would keep you awake. But if you wean yourself off of all of these, then you can easily get back to a regular rhythm. And Me, myself, when I was doing my PhD, I was staying up late into the night, and there are many days when I would go to bed after 4 o'clock in the morning, and I thought that that's my regular routine. And then all of a sudden, when I decided to try a regular routine, it was relatively easy. Within a month or so, I could go back to my now what is regular. I can actually go to sleep at before 11. And so it's not that difficult. You just have to self-experiment to see what keeps you awake. What are the elements in your life that actually keeps you awake or disrupts your circadian rhythm? And one of the simple things I discovered in my life was if I had a coffee after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or diet soda that has a lot of caffeine, then that would keep me awake, or it will be difficult for me to go to sleep at 11 or before 11. So similarly, some people might find that those who are used to going to gym in the evening, there are a lot of people who find that, okay, at the end of the day, they can go to the gym and do their weights, do their exercise. And that evening workout, late evening workout, I'm not talking about like 5 or 6 o'clock, maybe after 8 or 9, that would spike cortisol high, and it would be difficult for people to go to sleep. So if you discover what are the elements that is keeping you awake or making you very hard to fall asleep, then most people can get back to a regular rhythm.
This is the challenge I have whenever I travel to Europe, because I think that there's also cultural preferences, let's say. I remember my husband and I going to try and find a place to have dinner at 6 p.m. and no one was open. It's like, we only open at 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the evening. It's like, that is too late for dinner for me. I like to have dinner at 5 o'clock. And even just the coffee at the end, like, the Italians will always, not just Italians, anywhere they'll ask in Europe anyway, they'll say, do you want an espresso after dinner? And it's like, I can't have, it's 7 o'clock. If I have an espresso now, I'm not going to wait. I'm going to be up all night. So is there, and maybe you can speak about some of the cultural development of that. I mean, these practices, I mean, I love Italy. I love the language. I love the culture, but that specifically I find very difficult, where there is late eating and then they have a coffee, like a little, espresso at the end. Like, how did those habits become so cemented? And not just Italians. I'm like, this is like Portuguese, the Spanish are the same, the French are the same. In the summertime in Paris, the sun doesn't go down until 10 o'clock at night. The sun is still out. It's crazy. So how is it that things that seem really counterintuitive to healthy living, the way that you're describing, can be so entrenched in, let's say, I'm talking about European culture. I'm sure I'm missing a whole swath of other societies that do this as well. Like, what is the explanation for that? Is it just that they're just partying and they just sleep in? Like, what is it? Is it the siesta? What is going on there?
There are a few things. One is purely political and technical. Like, for example, when you are in Spain, you're wondering why everybody is having dinner only after 7:30 or 8 in the evening.
Yes.
And it's a political and technical issue with the timing, because actually, according to the solar cycle, their 7:30 in the evening is actually 6 o'clock, should be 6 o'clock, because, middle of the day, when the sun is right at its highest point, should be around between 12 and 1 o'clock. But actually, if you look at Spain is in the same longitude as the UK, but it's actually delayed by 1 hour from UK. So that means they got a bad deal.
Right.
So the western part of Europe should have been actually 1 hour, roughly 1 hour earlier. So when you're going to have dinner at 7:30 in Spain, it's not too bad, because you're actually having dinner 6 hours or 5 hours after the midpoint of no. So that's the technical point.
Okay.
The cultural point is, if you think about coffee and all these drinks that keep us awake, they were introduced as evening drinks. And the reason was, in the old days when there was no bright light, you have to stay awake for a few hours because we are social animals. We want to stay awake and unwind because whole day most of us work in a shitty job. So, for example, we don't actually like,
To put it bluntly.
yeah, we really don't like the work we do. Most people don't like the work they do, right?
Mhm.
And so that means in the evening, after the work is done, that's when we have full agency over our life. And that's when we want to socialize. We want to spend some time with friends to unwind, to forget
Right.
all the bad things that might have happened at work or to share some of the good things that might have happened during the day. And we need that social time. And to keep us awake, this coffee and other drinks were introduced so that we can stay awake and talk a little bit with our friends. And unfortunately, that habit actually stayed with us. And a little bit of coffee may not hurt some people, but those people who cannot metabolize coffee that easily and coffee stays in their system for a very long time, they have difficulty falling asleep. So that's why if you know your limit and if you know whether you can break down caffeine much faster than the others, then maybe it will help you to still indulge in some coffee and then fall asleep. And what is interesting is now people are finding that you may not be a coffee drinker, and when you start coffee, then it will keep you awake for a very long time. And after a few days of coffee drinking, you get habituated. So that means
Right.
the enzymes that break down your coffee actually work much better. So you break down coffee much better, and then you get habituated, and you can still fall asleep after the same cup of coffee that was keeping you awake. You can do this experiment yourself. So 1 or 2 days in a week, maybe in the weekend, you can stop coffee. And then you'll see that you are falling asleep much easier. And then Monday, when you go back to your coffee habit, you'll see that the same coffee with which you could fall asleep, you can no longer fall asleep. So there is some change in our own system that happens when we get habituated to all these habits.
That's fantastic. I have one more question actually about, I guess we'll call it a European question. I remember when I was invited to go speak at a conference in Estonia, which is very far north, beautiful country, beautiful food, beautiful people. The sun was still out at 11 p.m. at night, and it was up at 4. So this was in the middle of the summer. I know it's different over the winter time there, but we had blackout blinds, and the sun found its way through. It was like 3:30 in the morning. My whole hotel room was bright. So, and what do you do if you are someone who lives? I mean, this podcast, we have Americans, we have Canadians, we have Europeans, we have Australians, we have everyone all over the world listening. What do you do if you are living in or you travel to a place where the sunrise and set is quite different from either your hometown or, for example, I just mentioned Paris. In the summertime, the sun is still out at 10 o'clock. So how are we supposed to regulate that when we can't escape the light? And if the light is one of our master regulators, I know we haven't talked about the suprachiasmatic nucleus yet, we're going to get there, but how do you regulate that intake of light if you're someone who lives very far north, let's say, in northern European countries or northern Russia, in Canada, where there's sometimes the sun doesn't set. There's a time of the year where the sun does not set. What do you do in that scenario in order to try and regulate your light exposure?
Yeah, so the northern countries are very efficient. They have figured out ways to deal with long winter night and also long summer days. So starting from long summer days, you'll see more blackout curtains in northern countries than in the rest of the world. So that's one step. And personally, when I travel, actually, I have a bunch of eye masks. So
Yes.
just like you shop
Yes.
for clothing,
Mm-hmm.
you should not just settle for any eye mask. You can try different eye masks and see what is comfortable. Just like you spend time and research for your clothing, everybody should invest in some eye mask and also earplugs because there is a lot of noise that comes with the morning and evening. And also when you're in a different country, you don't know how much the air conditioning and other noises will. So that's one. And then the second, in the winter time is more challenging because it's easy to avoid light than to have enough light at the
Yeah.
right wavelength and intensity, because winter time is also very cold. You just can't walk out to get light whenever you want. So that's when it becomes more important that you get exposure to enough light in the morning when you wake up. And nowadays, there are many devices that claim to give you a lot more light. And then there are even wearable visors where you can put little wrap around on your eyeglasses that give you a little bit of blue light to reset your clock and improve mood. So I guess the point is the research over the last 25, 30 years has given us enough ammunition from enough tools, from very inexpensive or even free earplugs and eye masks all the way to very well-controlled LED lights that can be worn around your eyeglasses to give you the right amount of light at the right time. And we got to kind of choose judiciously what helps us, what goes with our lifestyle. Coming back to another point is, as you mentioned in summertime in Paris, there are also blue filtering eyeglasses that many people use in the evening to help them avoid blue light, because the blue light is the one that suppresses our night hormone melatonin and keeps us awake. And if we can reduce blue light, then hopefully it will help us to increase our evening melatonin rise that helps us fall asleep. And in many countries, the new LED lights that keep us awake are rich in blue light. So for example, if you walk into any department store or any grocery store, drugstore, and in many stores in Europe or anywhere in the world, they're very rich in blue light, and they can just slam a brake on your melatonin. So that's why it's important to kind of avoid all these brightly lit places. And also if you can have a pair of, just like you are having a pair of sunglasses to go out into the sun, similarly, everybody can invest a little bit into a pair of blue filtering glasses that they can wear. They will look cool. Some of them are cool looking. And that also helps for some people.
Wonderful. And let's actually talk about the mechanism there. I wanted to talk about what happens. We've mentioned, at the top of the hour, you said, your sleep, your eating, your exercise, and your light exposure. These are all things that we have some control over. But let's actually talk about the physiology behind it. So in the morning, when we want blue light exposure, talk a little bit about the receptor, like what happens when the sun is at a low solar angle, what's happening at the back of the retina, how that is activating master glands in the body, in the brain, and in the body. Let's talk about what happens in an ideal scenario. And then, of course, we can paint the picture of what happens when we are in a not so ideal scenario.
Yeah, so for almost 100 years or so, people knew that there are some blind people who cannot see anything. They can still sense light. So that means they will sense light that will tell them this is morning or this is evening, and they can entrain or synchronize their clock to the local time zone. And that was very mysterious because people thought, well, they cannot see, but they can sense that. So there must be a different light sensor. And almost 25 years ago, 3 different groups, including me, we discovered this new light sensor. It's called melanopsin, which means the same light sensor. All the light sensors are called opsins for human light sensors that are in the retina. And this opsin was present in the frog melanophore. So that means the frogs, if you put a frog outdoor in the sun, then the frog actually protects its skin by becoming darker in color. And that happens because this light sensor senses very bright light and then tells the pigment on the skin to spread out. And this is an example of how very foundational studies on figuring out what changes frog skin color can tell us how we reset our sleep-wake cycle. So what happened was, after 2001, when the human genome was sequenced, or we knew about all the genes, scientists found out that the same gene that changes the skin color of frog is also present in humans and mice and all the other mammals. And this gene codes for a protein called melanopsin that's present in only 5,000 cells or so in each human retina. So, for example, in each human retina or eye, we have nearly 40 million plus light sensors that give us what we call normal vision. But just imagine, against these millions of light sensors, we have only 5,000 of these light sensing proteins. And why is this? Because this light sensing protein, melanopsin containing cells, they're literally hardware. They connect the retina straight to the brain center, which is called suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's a mouthful, but the bottom line is this is the master circadian clock in our brain that controls our sleep-wake cycle, our hunger satiety cycle, and our activity rest cycle. So this is, although we have clocks in many different parts, this is like the master timekeeper. So these light sensing cells in the retina sense light and tell the brain clock whether it's day or night. The same light sensors also send information to other parts of the brain that are involved in alertness or depression and even migraine pain. And I'll get to that why. So in the morning, we're designed to actually be day active. So that means in the morning when we get up, we're designed to go outdoor because in the old days, there was no refrigerator to have food in the house. So we had to go out and look for food. And as we got out, the sunlight is the richest source of blue light. So if you take the sunlight and break it down to what wavelength of light is composed of, although we always think of rainbow as 7 different colors and all 7 colors might have equal contribution, but actually the blue light makes the biggest contribution to sunlight. So that blue light comes into our retina and activates this protein. And this protein is very different from other offsets. So for example, in a full moon night, you can go out and you can see to some extent what are around you, even at that dim light, full moon light, which is around 1 lux, which is 1 lux means if you have a candle burning in a room, only one candle, nothing else, then you can still see the room, right? So full moon is around 1 lux. So that you can see the room, you can see around you, but that light is not enough to activate this special melanopsin protein. And why is that? Because just imagine our ancestors on the full moon night, there was a lot of light around them, or in the evening when they lighted up a candle or had a campfire, there was light. But that light was not sufficient to activate this melanopsin. So as a result, although they can see, the brain thought or the master clock thought that it's dark. So the melatonin would naturally rise in the evening and people would go back to sleep. And in the morning when they went outdoor, then this huge amount of daylight, because when you are outside and the sun has just come up, then the light is around 1,000 lux. And then within 15 minutes of sun coming up, the light can hit 5,000 lux. And within an hour or so, it's above 100,000 lux. So that's super bright. And we are designed to see that super bright light for several minutes. And that light will reset our circadian clock and will activate all the brain centers that are involved in increasing alertness and reducing depression. And this is very important because almost all of us, nearly 85% of us, will experience at least one incidence of clinically diagnosed depression in our lifetime. But beyond that, besides that, many of us will experience a little bit of low and then winter blue and feeling less motivated. And all of that many of that can be taken care of if we have access to bright light, daylight during the daytime. So that's what happens in the daytime. We need at least an hour of 1,000 lux of light. And those who are at a risk for depression or those who are feeling a little bit low, then they need at least 5 to 10,000 lux of light, 5 to 10,000 lux is roughly outdoor in a cloudy day, if you're sitting under an umbrella or under a patio, then that's
Not
enough.
by a window. Not you
Not
have
by
to
a
be
window,
Not, I think
outside.
that's important because I think that a lot of people on the East Coast, like myself, will be like, "Oh, it's sunny. I'll just sit by the window." But the window will refract. It will distort the amount of light that you can perceive. Correct?
Yeah. So if you're right within a foot of the window, then you may get 1,000 lux. And if you go like a meter or 3 feet or 1 yard from the window, then the light actually drops precipitously down to 300 to 500 lux. So if you're normal, if you don't have any depression or anything, then you may be sitting very close to the window and can have breakfast, or maybe you can walk there. But if most of us actually will benefit by going outdoor, even on a cloudy day, being outdoor is very helpful. So now, if you compare how much of light you get in a normal indoor light bulb. So for example, it's winter time and you have closed all the windows and curtains, although we don't need to close all the curtains because you can still keep them open. It doesn't make your home cold or warm. Then most light bulbs nowadays will light up your houses to somewhere between 300 lux to 800 lux. If you have really bright light, a lot of ceiling lights and a lot of LEDs, that's what you'll get. And the law or the building standard in many places say that you should have 500 lux of light in an office space, which is not even 1,000 lux.
Nothing. Yeah, it's nothing.
Yeah, 500 lux. And so that's why it's important to go outdoor. So now what happens is when you go to all these commercial places, any drugstore or any grocery store, most of the drugstores and grocery stores, and even around the block, if you have a small convenience store like 7-Eleven, or in some cases in Japan Blossom and then few other stores, then nowadays they keep the lights pretty bright. So it's somewhere between 1,000 lux to 2,000 lux of light. So in the evening, when you're programmed to see less than almost like a candlelight or firelight, we are actually blasted with huge amount of light when we walk into a grocery store, drugstore. And that light, if we spend 15 minutes or longer, typically most of us will spend at least 15 minutes in a store. And that amount of light is enough to suppress our melatonin so that we stay awake. So melatonin hormone goes down. It also increases alertness because the same cells signal to the brain saying, hey, this is daytime. You should be staying awake. You should be alert. So that's why it's not a good idea to spend too much time in the evening in a brightly lit store or in any place that's super bright. And that keeps us awake. It's almost like having a couple of cups of coffee in the evening.
And so even in our own homes, maybe thinking about turning off the overhead lights if there is going to be light in the home. Maybe it's a table lamp or it's candlelight or something that would mimic what you were describing earlier, which is what our ancestors would do, where they would stay awake by fire, but the light was low. It wasn't coming from overhead.
Yeah, so one thing that most people can do is dimmer switch instead of flip switches in their home. So by dimming light in the evening, you can actually benefit from reducing light exposure. But in many houses, many households, there are also elder people or people who are injured. They cannot move outdoor and they need a little bit of light during daytime. So that's why dimmers are preferred, because you can crank up the light when you need it and you can crank down the light when you don't need it. And some of the LEDs, dimmable LEDs now even come with programmable LEDs. You can even program from an app when the light should be bright or less bright. So the bottom line is there are a lot of tools available to us. And if we make judicious use of those tools, then we can really use them to our advantage. And if we leave them without using them the way they're supposed to be, then it can also damage our sleep and circadian rhythm.
Talk to us a little bit about the metabolic effects of when we eat. So when we're thinking about light exposure and exposing, getting that suprachiasmatic nucleus to activate the genes that you were talking about. I'm assuming it also opens up the other maybe peripheral clocks in the body. Talk to us about some of the metabolic benefits of eating when it's light. And maybe you can talk about insulin, you can talk about glucagon, you can talk about hunger, ghrelin and leptin versus, let's say, eating later in the day. And this is sort of where I've really changed my attitudes around fasting even. I used to fast where I would start eating at noon and then maybe finish eating around 7 or 8 o'clock because I had an 8-hour feeding window. But I often found that I was starving before that 12 o'clock, opening time. And I just naturally kind of shifted it. So I just eat when I wake up now. But talk to us about maybe how even the same meal that you would eat at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning is going to be metabolized differently than if you were to eat it at, 7 or 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah, so this goes back to almost 70s or 80s when many physicians would see patients who are coming in and they may complain of high blood sugar. And what was interesting was suppose say you are healthy, you don't have any telltale sign of diabetes, and they would give them this bolus of sugary drink, and which is called oral glucose tolerance test. That's the medical term. Essentially, you drink this sugary drink, and then they would check your blood glucose 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours after the drink. The idea is your blood sugar should go up for a little while, and then if your body produces enough insulin, then insulin should take care of this blood glucose, because insulin essentially opens the doors in many cells to glucose so that the blood glucose enters the cells without loitering in their bloodstream. So the excess blood sugar is bad for us in our bloodstream. So typically most people will go back to normal blood sugar level within a couple of hours of drinking this sugary drink. But what they found was if the same people come in the evening and they give them this oral glucose tolerance test, then the blood sugar goes up too high and then stays high for a longer time. So that means depending on what time of the day you took your oral glucose tolerance test, you may be healthy if you come in the morning, or the same person may be misdiagnosed as diabetic if they come in the evening. But at the same time, it opened the eyes to other things. Like, for example, what if the same person is eating a big meal every night at 8 or 9 in the evening? So that means this person's blood sugar may not be controlled. And if the blood sugar remains high for a very long time, then slowly that can increase the hemoglobin A1C, glycated hemoglobin A1C. That's a technical term. And essentially, the person may be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. So it essentially boils down to the fact that our body is very different in processing our food between morning and evening. In the morning, we are more competent or are more efficient in digesting the food and absorbing all the nutrients and managing our blood sugar, whereas in the evening, we are not that efficient. And that observation has now been linked back to the mechanism that almost every cell in our body has a clock. So that means in the morning, our digestive system, starting from saliva production to digestive juice getting into our stomach to digest the food. And then after the food is digested and some sugar is getting into the blood circulation, that sugar activating pancreas to produce a little bit of insulin to take care of the blood glucose. All of these are more efficient in the first half of the day. It's not exactly as soon as we wake up, but in general, in the first half of the day. So that means up to 5-6 hours after we wake up. And then slowly that process slows down so that by the end of the day, when I say end of the day, so that is 3 to 4 hours before our habitual bedtime. So for example, if you're going to bed at 10 o'clock at night, from 7 o'clock onwards, this process is very inefficient. So even if you have the same food as your breakfast, what you had for breakfast, your blood sugar will remain high for a longer time. And now, over maybe 10, 15 years ago, scientists also made another very curious discovery that people who are obese or overweight or have type 2 diabetes, when they're trying to figure out which genes contribute to this obesity or diabetes, they found that one of the genes that were responsible was a melatonin receptor. And it was kind of weird because melatonin usually we link melatonin to sleep, but how melatonin is linked to obesity or diabetes. And then one school of thought based on very beautiful science and experiments is this melatonin sensing protein, that's why we call it melatonin receptor, is actually present in pancreas and that produces insulin. And when this melatonin receptor is engaged or when it senses melatonin, it slows down insulin production and release. So that means in the evening, as your body is preparing to sleep and melatonin is slowly rising, melatonin, just like it helps our brain to sleep, it also makes our pancreas to sleep. So that when we eat in the presence of melatonin, we don't produce enough insulin and our blood sugar can remain high for a longer time. And when our blood sugar remains high and we have a tiny drip of insulin coming in for a very long time, it also promotes making fat because our body produces fat in the presence of insulin. And if insulin is released slowly, it's almost like instead of turning on your sprinkler, you're turning on a dripper and you still have to produce or you still have to dispense the same amount of insulin. It remains high for a long time and that will promote fat production, fat accumulation. So now people have gone back to check and they have found that those who have this mutation in melatonin receptor gene that makes it more sensitive to melatonin, they're likely to have their postprandial or after a meal, their blood glucose is likely to stay high for a very long time in the evening, and they're also more likely to gain weight. So in this context, it's very interesting that you can eat the same meal in the first half of the day and you may not gain too much weight, whereas the same meal in the evening can disrupt your normal glucose regulation and can even nudge you towards gaining some weight.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about my beautiful women who are listening to the show who may see themselves in what you were describing, right? So this that we have, this melatonin receptor is present in the pancreas. Of course, women in midlife see changes in body composition. They start saying things like, hey, the things that were working for me in when I was 20, when I was 30, even when I was late 30s, early 40s, no longer working for me now in my 40s and 50s. And then sleep is a really big issue for women. Those are probably the top two complaints that I'll hear from women. It's like body composition changes despite having the same types of food, and then sleep changes in midlife. So talk to us a little bit about what happens to a woman who maybe is in her perimenopausal or menopausal years, where we're starting to see changes in her reproductive hormones. So we're seeing declines in her estrogens, in her androgens, in her progesterone, and how that may have a knock-on effect to, I lovingly call them like the menopausal munchies. It's like women they're just always hungry, right? So how that can impact our our perception of our metabolic requirements, and then also how that decline in reproductive hormones can also be affecting our sleep. And then the second question I'll ask you after that is, what can we do about it?
Yeah. So actually, women are really resilient against gaining weight. And you may be surprised because almost every woman complains about gaining weight. But actually, the estrogen, progesterone, all these hormones protect women from gaining excessive body weight and also protect them against type 2 diabetes and liver disease and many other diseases. And in fact, the saying is, if you're a male, then you gain 1 point as one risk for getting pre-diabetes or diabetes.
Yeah.
So the female reproductive hormones are extremely protective against many metabolic disease. So as the hormones decline, then women become like men in the sense that the risk for obesity, diabetes, and all of this go up because the hormones that are protecting them, acting as a shield against all this disease, metabolic dysfunction, slowly goes down. And how do we know that? Even if you take your lab rats or lab mice, they also show the same effect, like female mice and female rats. Even if you give them really bad food, they don't easily gain weight. But if you just take away the female hormones, then they rapidly gain weight and they become diabetic and all the bad things happen. So now, coming back to women unfortunately are the caregivers in the family. When the kid is sick, the kid is not going to cling to the dad. Even in my house, I have seen that. They will go cling to the mom. And that's one reason why what happens is when the kids actually reach middle school and high school, then we all become the drivers driving them in the evening to different activities. And you may be eating the same food, but at the same time, you may be eating that food very late into the night. After the practices are done, you come back with the family van and unload these kids. That's when you may have time to eat that food. And this is one example where, just like your best friend knocking on your door in the midnight is not your best friend anymore. Even though you're eating the same healthy food as what you are eating for many, many years is not giving you any more benefit. The other thing that happens is, whether you're male or female, the late young life, I don't want to call it midlife, starting from, say, between...
I like to call it the after party.
The after party, yes. Yeah. Between 40 and 55, that's the time we go through a lot of stress, because that's the time when you realize that your kids are growing up. You will be empty nesters soon. So they're trying to do your best to be the best parent. So you're caregiving a lot to your kids. That's the time when there is a lot of work pressure, because you are mostly likely to be a manager, supervisor, overlooking projects, and there is a lot more responsibility at work. And that's also the time when your parents may be falling sick and they may need more care. Even though they may not be in the same place as you are, they expect you to check on them. So all this stress also affects us. We might pick up some bad habits by choice or to cope with the stress. So we should not forget that there is a social and very personal aspect to going through midlife or the after party. And once we're aware of this, it's not that nobody's going through. So some people are not going through it. Everybody is going through it. But figuring out some coping skill to cope with this actually helps us to stick with the right habit and also recognizing the impact of timing. Because the biggest stress that happens during this time, as you said, is sleep disruption. Either we are too stressed, or we have a lot of responsibilities, or simply put, our partners have started snoring or sleep apnea. So that also affects us. Or you picked up a pet, and that pet happens to be a nocturnal animal. That animal gets into your bedroom. So a lot of things happen that disrupt our sleep. So that's why it's important that we recognize this hormonal aspect, the real life aspect of dealing with many stresses, being caregivers at home, at work. You are essentially giving care to the project or your team. And your personal ambition, because you're thinking that, well, now I have only 20 to 30 years, last 2 decades of productive life. How can I do the best out of it? The bottom line is, don't stress out. Everybody is going through the same thing. Pick up some coping skill. And now understanding some of the biological principles of what our body is going through, how our hormones are changing, and how we can be a little bit more careful actually helps. And the way I look at it is, those of you who have a self-driving car or automatic car, when you're young, your body is almost like full self-driving. And you don't have to think too much about it because you have a lot of resilience. And then it becomes kind of the old school car where you still have to pay attention to the brake and gas. And then as you get older, it actually becomes a manual car. You really have to pay a lot of attention to drive this car. So that's why
The air
we have,
condition stops working. You start
yeah, you have to roll down
getting
the
hot
window.
flashes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, all of this.
Yeah.
So all of this help. So what we say is in the middle life, these are the things that happen. Another thing that happens is just like our hormones make us more light sensitive and we tend to become more nocturnal as we hit menopause, and even for males also, as the hormones levels go down, we tend to become early bird. So we cannot sleep well, and we are also more likely to get out of bed much earlier in the morning.
Is that because we're lighter sleepers? We're not reaching like deeper stages of sleep? Or is that just is it that phasic shift of the circadian clock again?
So we think it's the phasic shift of the circadian clock. We don't know exactly the mechanism or whether we become less sensitive to light or our morning arousal signals hit us much earlier. Some people thought that we produce less melatonin, but now more and more studies are saying that that's not true. So, but
that's interesting. I heard that too. I heard that your melatonin production like falls off a cliff at like 52 or something like that.
Yeah, I was also thinking the same way. But then I talked to my colleagues in Harvard who actually are looking at melatonin rhythms in complete isolation. So they bring people and to make sure that there is no interfering effect, they keep them in isolation and then measure melatonin. And they're finding that no, it's not true. An older individual is still able to produce sufficient amount of melatonin. But the bottom line is you are more likely to be early bird. And then what happens is you have a conflict. Your teenagers in the house are night owl and you're waking up early and you're feeling lonely because no one is up. And you do all
That's
this
when
stuff.
I go for my exercise. That's what I do now. I go for my exercise when the whole house is asleep. My kids are still sleeping. I'm out for doing my thing and then I'm back and then they wake up.
Yeah. So you can actually, so this is an example where you can adapt to all these changes. And hopefully when you're getting out of the house, you are also getting some sunlight and that's also restarting your day, which is a good thing. But a lot of us, we wake up and then the first thing we do is we have a cup of coffee with cream and sugar, or we think that breakfast is the best thing in their life. So we should wake up and eat our breakfast within an hour of waking up, which is not the right thing to do because that's when your melatonin is still halfway down. So just like in the evening, melatonin inhibits your insulin production and release immediately after waking up. I'm talking about within an hour after waking up. Your melatonin is still high and your cortisol spikes within 45 minutes of waking up. So you have both high cortisol, high melatonin. And that's why in many of our studies, we advise our participants to delay your breakfast by at least 1 hour after waking up so that you have gone through that cortisol spike and melatonin low, and then
both which oppose insulin, right? Like they both sort of are counter-regulatory. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So that's one of the challenges that we see. And if you delay your breakfast by an hour or sometimes 2, I'm sure you may be eating your breakfast after 2 hours of waking up because you're doing exercise in the morning. Then that also gives you a healthy window because in most of our intermittent fasting or time restricted eating, whatever way you call, we ask our participants to stick to 10-hour window because we see that 10 hours is more practical. Most people can stick to 10 hours for at least 5 days a week. And if they can do 8, that's better, but 10 is relatively more practical. And if you're starting your 10-hour window 1 to 2 hours after waking up, then, for example, if you wake up at 6 or 7, because, as you get after party stays, you're waking up a little bit earlier. And your breakfast is at 8 or 9, then that gives you a very good window of 6 or 7 in the evening when the kitchen will close. So
Yep.
Yeah, so that's what we usually advise our participants, and that also increases their compliance so they can stick to it. Another thing that happens in the evening is, in addition to this melatonin rhythm and insulin rhythm, we also have a rhythm in our intestine. So after we finish our eating, for example, even if you finish your dinner at 6 p.m., your stomach is still digesting that food for another 4 to 5 hours. So that means your mouth might have stopped eating, but your stomach is still digesting until 10, 11 at night. And then after that digestion, the food has to pass through the intestine through what we call peristalsis movement. So slowly it squeezes and expands that food, so it goes through that digestive process. Most of your protein is actually absorbed in the intestine, and few other nutrients are absorbed there. And unfortunately, your intestine has to sleep. So the peristalsis movement also slows down during your sleep. So that means if you eat very close to your bedtime, your blood sugar might stay high for a long time. Your food may be half digested and it will stay in your intestine until the intestine wakes up next day morning. So that means you're more likely to develop dysbiosis, or your half digested food can promote the growth of unwanted bacteria. And since your digestion is not complete, that will also affect your nutrition level and your gut repair process. So these
And
are...
don't you feel I have weird dreams whenever I eat late? I don't know, it's just a weird thing that I have. But anytime I eat late at night, and I don't often, but if there's a wedding or something, I have the craziest dreams. And I don't know if that's because my intestines, as you've been describing, have gone to sleep, and it's just, I don't know what it is, but it's crazy land.
Yeah. I mean, when you're dreaming, you're actually in your REM sleep. So that means you're in your light sleep.
Oh,
So-
okay. Yeah.
So that means you're actually in a light sleep for a long period of time, and then your mind is just wandering and picking up random stuff.
Let me ask you about exercise, actually, because I just mentioned to you, I get up in the morning and I go to the gym, I'll lift my weights. I realize that is not the ideal time to train. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about circadian rhythm, exercise, and performance for women, understanding that you're going to talk about what's ideal based on circadian biology and core body temperature and all of that. And someone like myself who has the teenagers and the work and all the things doesn't necessarily have the time to adapt ideally. So, but I do want my listeners to understand from a mechanistic perspective, how can we, if it is available to us, how can we optimize performance when we're taking into account circadian rhythm and exercise?
Yeah, so exercise at any time is better than no exercise. Let's make that clear. So
Yeah.
whatever time you're getting to exercise, you should do that. When it comes to intense exercise, then there is some data now showing that late afternoon exercise may be better than early morning exercise. But here again, there are some caveats, because all the studies are done on people who habitually don't exercise or habitually maybe exercising at a random time. And then when you're putting them into late or early, then you might see some effect that may not be observed if these people habitually exercise in the morning. So the point is, suppose say I don't exercise, and then I was recruited to a study where I asked to exercise in the morning for a couple of weeks, or 5 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever it is. And then I'm asked to rest for a few weeks. And then I'm asked to exercise in the afternoon. And then they figure out what is my performance. Or vice versa. My twin brother may be recruited to the same study. He might start in the morning exercise, then wash out, and then, he may start with the afternoon exercise, wash out, and then morning exercise. So what people are finding, some scientists are finding, is late afternoon exercise, the same exercise, will reduce blood sugar level much more efficiently than the same exercise in the morning. But what is interesting is, as people exercise more and more, the morning exercise group also begin to see the same benefit as the afternoon exercise group. So there is this caveat. So this is for blood sugar in people who have pre-diabetes or diabetes. So this study actually gained a lot of attention recently, and there's some physiological explanation for this too. So one thing is all these studies are done with people who are doing high intensity interval training, very strenuous exercise. And we know that for many of these exercises, your body has to warm up. You need some warm up period, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And usually late afternoon, our body is naturally warmer than in the morning. So that might be one reason why late afternoon exercise is better for performance, whether it's metabolic performance or physical performance.
And it's less injurious too. Like the tendons are warm, the ligaments are warm, that kind of
Everything is warm. So then, particularly for older, middle-aged or older adults, it's actually much better to exercise in the late afternoon because your risk for injury is less. Your motor coordination is much better because your brain is awake. When you are exercising, your brain is also telling your muscles to coordinate so that you don't fall, your steps are perfect and all that stuff. So that's why late afternoon exercise is much better. Then if you come to elite athletes, then there is also some data showing that late afternoon exercise or late afternoon performance is way much better than early morning because the performance difference between morning and afternoon is larger than the time difference between gold medal and silver medal in Olympics. So,
Oh, wow. Okay.
So in some of the sports. So these are some of the findings. So then what people should be doing, one thing is, okay, so if you have teenage kids who are into sports, the best thing you can do is let them sleep enough. Because what we are seeing is a lot of teenagers, just like you said, teenagers are starting to see their soccer practice or soccer game at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night. They are going to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning. They don't have enough time for recovery. And that's really difficult on these young people. And particularly for young women who are into soccer, they are more likely to injure a tendon or ligament. And then the entire sports world may be completely closed for them if you have a serious injury. So that's why it's important to give everybody enough time to rest after exercise or after sports practice. And then coming back to what everybody can do is if you're doing exercise in the morning, continue exercising. Don't stop that. But if you have the option of exercising late afternoon, then maybe it's better to switch to late afternoon exercise. And if you can do it even outdoor, that's much better. Going for a run, going for outdoor activities is much better because you get both exercise and light exposure at the same time.
Fantastic. So if I'm paraphrasing here, like if we were in an optimal world, maybe in the morning you might go for a walk or something outdoors where you're getting that blue light from the sun that's resetting the circadian clock. And then if you have time to allow that core body temperature, the joints, the tendons, the motor coordination to sort of reach its peak, it's somewhere, is it like 1 p.m. to 4 p.m.-ish? Like what would be the ideal sort of time for that?
So it's usually late afternoon. So it's typically after 3 p.m. till maybe 6, 7 p.m. That's seems to be.
And then what's the cutoff? So what is the point where you start interfering with that high intensity, with that cortisol and being able to kind of recover from that post-exercise?
Yeah, so there is a very nice paper that came out in Nature Communication recently from Australia, and they looked at thousands of people. They found that those who did high intensity exercise after 7 p.m., I guess, within, say, 3 to 4 hours of their bedtime, habitual bedtime, then it interferes with their sleep. So I always go by the habitual bedtime because if somebody is going to bed at 9 p.m., then 3 hours before is very different from someone going to bed at 11 or midnight.
Right. Okay, great. I love that. And then what about, we hear a lot about exercise snacks. So maybe people don't have the time to go to the gym or to go to, to go for an hour-long jog or whatever it is there a role for non-continuous exercise as a way to support circadian biology? And does it follow the same rules that you just described, where maybe it's, you want to sort of cut it off at about 3 to 4 hours before bedtime?
Yeah, so this becomes very important for after party. So particularly after menopause, what happens is, as I said, we are more likely to wake up early. We are also more likely to be more active in the first half of the day, become
Right.
almost sedentary in the second half or in the evening because, particularly empty nesters whose kids have gone to college and you have not much to do and your friends are busy throughout the week. In the late afternoon, you just come home and then sit in front of the computer, sit in front of the TV or streaming services in the evening. So that becomes an issue because you just had a nice dinner and then your blood sugar is pretty high and you're sedentary. So this is where some exercise snack, even a little bit of movement after dinner, walking around the block, or if you want, you can even have 10 or 20 squats.
Yeah.
And those things actually help.
Yeah.
And even doing your laundry, going up and down the stairs, because we don't pay attention, but we actually become more and more sedentary towards the late afternoon, evening time as we get older. And there are also a lot of data showing how we get older and how we reduce our nighttime or late afternoon exercise, and our dinner also becomes bigger meal towards the end. So it's very counterproductive for our health. So these exercise snacks, which is not going to increase your cortisol level too high, and you're not going to sweat. It's just some movement. It's very important to have in late afternoon.
Just to get the
evening.
food into the muscles.
Yeah.
Just enough to get the food out of the blood, the blood sugar, to get it out of the blood and maybe get it stored in the muscles as glycogen.
Yeah, because there is also, muscle also absorbs glucose in insulin-independent fashion. If you activate your muscle, do some little exercise, then even though your pancreas is not producing enough insulin, or pancreas has gone to sleep, you can still get few extra grams of sugar into your muscle.
Wonderful. Well, this has been so enlightening. My last question for you is, what are some of the, you are such a, well-decorated, well-respected scientist and author and researcher. What are some of the ways that you incorporate some of these topics, these strategies that we have been discussing today into your own life?
Oh, yeah. So almost 15 years ago, we did the first experiment in mice showing that when you feed mice even on healthy diet within 8 to 10 hours, then we can protect these mice against metabolic disease. And if we think about most of our diseases or uncompromised health, I would say, come from a few things, 3 foundations of health. Either we are less active, so physical activity is important. Second is we don't sleep enough, or we have fragmented sleep. And then the third one is nutrition. And what we also saw in most of our experiments is once you take care of the eating time, it has a cascading positive effect on both physical activity and also on sleep. To make it simpler, what we have found was people who eat within, say, 8 to 10 hours, they're more likely to sleep much better, and they're more likely to feel more energetic in the morning and throughout the day. And we never thought that how eating time would affect sleep. But now, in retrospect, when we go back to experiments, we're finding that that's true. The other thing is activity, and at least in laboratory mouse experiments or rat experiments, if we feed mice within 8 to 10 hours, then they can stay on treadmill twice longer than mice that eat whenever they want. And that was very surprising because people thought that if you are eating only for 8 to 10 hours and you're fasting for 14 to 16 hours, it might make you weak and you may not be able to perform well.
Yeah.
But the exact opposite is true, that these mice, at least, they actually perform much better on treadmill. And then the question is why? And then we're finding slowly that the muscle repair process and the processes that help the muscle to use energy become more efficient when they're on this intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding protocol. So now, combining all of this, after we saw this result, it was no brainer to kind of use a 8 to 10 hours eating window. So actually, I try to eat everything within 10 hours because means my wife also wants to have breakfast with me and dinner with me. So if I eat within 8 hours, then it becomes impossible. I have to sacrifice one meal. So yeah, so I try to eat between, say, 7:30 a.m. and, say, 5:30 p.m. in the evening when I'm in town. And then during daytime, mostly in the late afternoon, like before dinner or after dinner, I also go for a run or walk, and that helps a lot. Then in terms of light exposure, actually, I realized I used to wear a light sensor, and then I realized that even in San Diego, I don't get enough light exposure during daytime.
Yeah.
So I stopped wearing sunglasses because,
Stop wearing them.
I stopped wearing because
Yes.
what happens is, with it, most of the time we're not exposed to sunlight. We're usually inside a car, and that's when you get most of your light. And the car windows are already filtering out all the bad UV light. So you don't have to worry about the wrinkles around your eyes because there is not much UV light inside your car. And also in the office here, if I open the windows, then I get daylight, a lot of daylight, but not UV light. So that's another thing that has happened. And then the third thing is I changed most of the light switches in the house to dimmers. So now the house is relatively dim. So it's actually a shock when I go to some of my friends' houses and they don't have dimmers and the light is super bright. I'm always worrying. I'm saying, what are you doing to your health?
To your body. Yeah, I love that because this is I'm so happy I'm so grateful to you for coming on the show because I think that I'm often asked, what are some of the ways that I can optimize my health? I don't have thousands and thousands of dollars to drop on lab tests and, I'm not a fan of the word biohacking, but biohacking this and that, right? It's like what you've been talking about is for the most part free and available to all of us. And even, we started this conversation by saying, we have agency over how much light we get, when we eat, when we go to sleep, how and when we exercise, the intensity of the exercise, timing that with the time of day. And I think that these are the barrier to entry for these are so low and everybody can adopt them and everybody can live a better life because of it. So I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. I was loving the nerding out with you, and thank you for calling it the after party. I really appreciate that, and I know that this can be so valuable. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. And as I said, this is very simple stuff. So that's why we have been doing all this research with a research app, and then recently we thought, okay, what can people take away? So we developed this app called Ontime Health. The whole idea is, we are all busy, and we cannot keep track of too many things. But if there are 5 or 6 things that we can keep track of, this is when you started eating. When do you actually stop eating? And did you get 1 or 2 hours of daylight? And are you getting enough sleep? So these are very simple things. But the best thing about life comes from simple things. So for example, the simplest investment you make to look better is actually having a mirror. Because only when you can look at yourself, then you realize whether you have to fix your hair or put some makeup or whatever it is. So similarly, having a tracker or having an app is a mirror to our habit. And when we see where we are lacking, then we can fix that part. And unless we know that, we cannot fix. We assume that we are doing everything right, but we don't have a way to figure out whether we are doing right and how many days in a week or how many days in a month we are doing
Yeah.
it right.
Yeah. And that which you manage, it's like that which you measure, you can manage. So this is like a circadian coach,
Yeah.
essentially. And it's called Ontime Health.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's called.
So we'll make sure that there's a link for that. I'm assuming it's in the App Store, and it's good for iPhone users and Samsung and Android users. So we'll make sure that link is available there as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and have a perfect circadian day.
Thank you so much. I love that. Welcome to the after party, where I share with you my favorite moments from my conversation. So this, obviously, if you've gotten this far, you are a dark roast Betty. You are in it to win it. I want to tell you that I have wanted Dr. Panda on the podcast maybe since its inception. So first of all, what an honor to have such a decorated scientist on the show. I think my favorite part, I was just saying this to my AV producer, was that he took my little nickname for menopause and just went with it. He's like, yeah, the after party. and then just used it all the way through. Every time he talked about menopausal women, he was calling it the after party. And there's something so satisfying and wonderful about such a well-respected scientist using my silly little moniker for menopause. Like, it was just like, took it and rolled with it. I just loved that. So hat tip to you, Dr. Panda. Thank you so much. So a couple of things that I loved that I learned about. First is that melatonin doesn't actually fall off a cliff the way that we previously thought. So I mentioned in the show, I thought like after 52, just melatonin falls off a cliff the same way that our sex hormones do in menopause. And apparently this is no longer the current thinking. So I thought that was really interesting, and also a bit of a reprieve, because I think that women are just like, gosh, everything gets worse, like including my melatonin production. So I thought that was a little bit of a, okay, so I'm still keeping something, right? He did talk about how we become more early bird like as we age, which I thought was, also very validating for me, because I am noticing that a little bit. I used to, when I was a student, up all night, studying for my exams and all the things. And then as I have entered into midlife and beginning to approach 50, I love to go to bed. It's like 11 p.m., like 9 p.m. is the new 11 p.m., and like 8:30 is, I like to be in bed at 8:30, and I do my little glow ritual, my little gratitude learns, opportunity wins with my husband, and then off to bed I am. So loved the melatonin piece. The other thing that I thought was super interesting, and he kind of, I almost want to do a whole podcast on, I think you could really get really geeky around it, was this idea that our organs also go to sleep. It's such a simple but elegant idea that, yes, of course, our intestines, if you eat very close to dinner, then, if you have your dinner very close to your bedtime, I should say, that the peristalsis, that natural squeezing motion that, that your small and large intestines use to actually move the food, move the bolus through, slows down. And so as your intestines, air quote, go to sleep, if you're eating really late in the day, that food is going to remain undigested. And so you can get a whole host of digestive issues that come from that. You can get, Satchin was talking about the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, like SIBO or SIFO. And I also just think of like just general digestive distress. Like, imagine having food undigested in your system overnight. Like, when you wake up, you're not going to really feel that great. So I really enjoyed that. I liked how he talked about the different chronotypes shifting over the course of our lives. So understanding potentially what might be, or maybe it's just what I'm living through right now, is a bit of an evolution, like a bit of a chronotype mismatch, where my teenagers are now wanting to stay up later and later and later, and their activities are getting later and later and later in the day. And I want to be in bed at 8:30. So, like I mentioned very briefly, my son had a soccer game, it was recently, it was like 9 p.m. at night. And I was like, who is taking him? Because it's not going to be me, because I'm going to get into an accident. I can't drive that late at night. So I loved that. And then the other thing I really loved, I'm just looking at my notes here, I loved that he was talking about the same meal, whether you take it, let's say at 9 in the morning versus 7 or 8 at night, can look completely different in terms of your metabolic response. So the insulinergic response to food is going to be vastly different in the morning versus the evening. I thought that was fantastic. And then the last thing I loved was his own applications in his life, specifically that he now no longer wears sunglasses. And I like that he said, and I was like, oh, my Betties are going to love this. He's like, don't worry about the wrinkles in your eyes because you already have the UV light filtering all that stuff out, like the UVA and the UVB that ages and burns us. But now you just take your sunglasses off in the car, which is where most of us get our light anyway, and you can help reset your circadian rhythm. So just loved that. Gosh, there was such goodness. Actually, you know what? One other thing I'll say. The other thing I loved was right at the top of the hour where he was talking about how the circadian rhythm influences our infradian rhythm. So infradian rhythms they're just cycles that are longer than 24 hours. So for example, women and their menstrual cycles. And he was talking about fertility, how you can optimize if you're someone who is thinking about getting pregnant, how you can optimize your circadian rhythm, which can help with your infradian rhythm and your fertility chances. So I thought that was fascinating as well. Overall, just a kind of a pinch me moment. He's somebody that I've, like I said, wanted on the show forever. And I said this at the end of the show, but I'll just reiterate it because it is so important. All of the strategies that he talked about you don't need like a $2,000 a month subscription to some, I don't know, very niche biohacking thing. This is light and exercise and eating. These are things that we are doing hopefully every day and we have agency over and we can control. And for all of you type A Betties, hello, me looking right at myself here. I love the ability to manipulate those variables to optimize health. And it's like literally no cost. So I love that. And, in times like whether there are financial uncertainties or we're just trying to be smart with our money, I love these low cost or no cost ways that we can manipulate our health for the better. So let me know what you thought of this show. Leave a comment or review on Spotify. Leave us something on Apple iTunes. We read all the comments. We read all the reviews, the good, the bad, the ugly. I would love to know what actionable items you took from the show. And until next time, my friends, I bid you adieu. We'll see you soon.